Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. And there's been a lot of them, so I wanted to remind folks that they can dig into the archive both at PRN, at Podbean, and at my own Techgnosis website, techgnosis.com, which also features tons of writing by me and indications about upcoming events. In a couple of months, I'll be doing a lot of events based on my upcoming book, High Weirdness, and I'm very excited about that. I'll be in the West Coast, East Coast, and in Europe. I also wanted to remind folks that if they want to, they can call up PRN and leave a message for Expanding Mind, which is kind of fun to weave your voices into the show. 1-701-719-0890 is the number, 1-701-719-0890. And again, we love feedback, and we particularly love feedback on iTunes and other places where people read about podcasts, because I think we're doing a fun thing here. Well, I'm very excited about today's show. Of course, that's something I could say every week, but it's particularly true today. Many years ago, I became friends with a wonderful writer and tarot expert named Rachel Pollack. We did a wonderful conversation, she and I, and Neil Gaiman, for the magazine Gnosis back in the 90s, which is a wonderful magazine that I still miss. And we talked about mythology and the tarot and popular culture and how they all kind of interact. It was a wonderful conversation, and getting to know Rachel and reading her books on tarot and getting some readings from her, which were wonderfully spontaneous. I expected this very arcane, deeply symbolic, ritualistic kind of experience, and it was so wonderfully casual. It was that kind of like almost spontaneous kind of reading that you get only when you really reach a level of true mastery, where it becomes almost simple in appearance, but very deep in effect and richness. Rachel talked a lot about her friend Mary Greer, who is probably the most well-known tarot master or mistress or goddess or oracle that we have here in the United States. And so I've been meaning to talk to Mary for many years, and I have a huge list of names to get to, and it's just kind of crazy. But I have a wonderful excuse, which is that she participated in a fabulous book that just came out, Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story. And for those of you who are not too hip to the deep lore, the famous so-called Rider-Waite tarot deck, which is the one that everybody knows the most. I guess some people know Aleister Crowley's Thoth deck the most, but most of us know the so-called Rider-Waite deck the most. And I say so-called because one important name missed from that is Pamela Colman Smith, who actually did the designs for the work. And while she was guided by A.E. Waite for some of the work, particularly the trumps, the major arcana, she really probably contributed a great deal to a lot of the images that people have come to love all over the world. It's an incredibly popular work. I mean, it's a major story in pop card success, and U.S. Games has been cranking them out since the early 1970s under the devoted hand of Stuart Kaplan, who's also a collector of Pamela Smith's work. And he wrote the main text and put together this wonderful volume, which is kind of the coolest art book that's ever come out on from a company that has game systems in its title, because it's U.S. Game Systems. It's wonderfully illustrated. I learned a huge amount about this person that I knew a little bit about. She's a very compelling character, nicknamed Pixie, and when you see photographs of her, you can see why. Very independent, minded, spirited, spent time in Jamaica. Just a delightful being, you can tell, both through her art and through the stories of her experiences. Very DIY in a way, did her own magazines, her own publications for a while, and illustrated many things, most of which I had never seen before. So I highly recommend this book if you're into, esotericism in art or the tarot or even just the history of popular illustration, because she's a remarkable illustrator at a time, arguably the best time for illustration for kids books or mythology or things like that. At least in my opinion, that's kind of the golden age, and she's really taking it in some really interesting ways. So it's wonderful to see the range of her work, as well as to contemplate how her own influences and her own experiences fed into this set of images, this tarot deck, that has had such an enormous impact, not just in terms of visual imagery or showing up in a Led Zeppelin record or films or, things like that, but just in terms of articulating, shaping people's unconscious or their encounters with archetypal forces or symbolic forces, and the tremendous influence the deck itself has had on other decks. So there's no one who could help us unpack this better than Mary Greer. So Mary, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Oh, Eric, I'm very glad to be here. And that was a wonderful introduction to her book.
Yeah. Well, tell me, I'm actually kind of curious, when you, in your, discovery and exploration of the tarot, first sort of became intrigued with who this artist was and how difficult it was to find out about her, and at what point you really became sort of enamored of her and her particular influence on this deck, or her expression through this deck.
Well, my first introduction to tarot was an Eden Gray book back in 1967. And I immediately set out to find the deck, which was the Pamela Colman Smith, then known as Rider-Waite Tarot from University Books. And that was the only deck that was readily available, but you had to even go far afield to find a store that would have it. So I had been asking all around. I loved the deck right off because it was so amiable to telling stories. Getting someone to talk about what they saw in it, which was what I was very interested in, because I was coming from a strong interest in Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and archetypal criticism in my English classes. So it just spoke to me immediately. But my interest in her in particular really came up in the early 70s when Melinda Boyd Parsons curated a museum exhibit of her artwork, primarily other works of art that she had done, and wrote a wonderful catalog for it that talked about some of the sources of her imagery. So Melinda was part of the biography of Pamela Colman Smith. She wrote a section on the tarot deck itself, because she had been really looking at what could be the sources for the imagery that Pamela included in the deck that went beyond what Waite had dictated.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's a really interesting point. It's funny that there's in my mind, the two most significant decks in the English-speaking world are the Waite-Smith deck or Smith-Waite deck and the Thoth deck. And in both cases, you have the sort of conventional story is that the great magus, the male mind who's putting together all this arcane symbology, then just sort of dictates it to this, to the female scribe who manifests their visions. And it's such a gendered, traditionally gendered story. And then, of course, you look more closely at it and you go, wait, that's actually not entirely what's happening. It's like, yes, the guys were doing that, and they may have been thinking that that's what they were doing. But in both cases, in very different ways, but in both cases, you discover that a lot of what people are responding to and a lot of what gives the decks their lasting character is actually supplied by the artist. And in the case then, which then leads to the question, like, well, how much influence do they have? And we, as far as I understand it, we don't know that much, because we only have some vague hints, particularly about the minor arcana, the pip cards. So can you talk a little bit about how revolutionary the deck was in terms of the pip cards, and how you have come to see what what Pamela Smith was doing with her illustrations of those cards in particular, the numbered cards?
Yes, it seems that she was pretty much left alone to create the minor arcana cards, which you're calling the pip cards. The decks before that just had abstract symbols, like a regular playing card deck, except that it was wands, cups, swords, and coins on the older decks. And actually batons instead of wands on most of the early decks. And the Golden Dawn reconceptualized those using the pentacles as a magic symbol of protection instead of coins. And Pamela Colman Smith seemed to have been left on her own, perhaps given a variety of meanings for each of the cards, but to come up with the pictures and images that would express those. So that totally transformed tarot. There was an early deck that did have some illustrations on the minor arcana cards. That was the Solabusca deck, which was practically unknown at the time, but photographs had been sent to the British Museum, and Waite lived at the British Museum, knew all the curators there. So I'm sure he took Pamela immediately to see these images. So we have the 10 of Wands with a man carrying 10 sticks on his back, and we have the 3 of Swords with 3 swords through the heart, and a couple of others. But even with the Solabusca deck, there's like 5 or 6 cards showing a man with a bunch of sticks on his back. So there was the same motif repeated over and over again through many of the cards, whereas Pamela took the concept or idea and a couple of the images and used that throughout the entire 36 minor arcana cards. I do think Waite worked with her on the aces because there's some very particular symbolism that was particular to him, appears over and over in his books where he talks about those. But the 2 through 10 seem to be very original to her, based on basic meanings that he gave her and possibly a hint of a storyline. But we know she was working very quickly for a couple of months at a place called Small Hythe, the home of Ellen Terry, the British actress who was her foster mother. And she incorporated a lot of imagery from that environment.
Well, you'd mentioned before about how great they are for storytelling, how suggestive they are of stories, but you're just getting these little slices of it. And I wrote a brief piece about the deck a number of years ago, and one of the things that I was thinking about was, there's a lot going on in the late 19th century. Not only the Golden Dawn and sort of the initiation of the modern occult revival in many ways, coming from some French sources, but really in the English-speaking world, that was the kind of the source for modern occultism, but also the emergence of new media of the imagination. And what sort of strikes me when I was kind of looking at these images again and thinking about, particularly with the numbered cards, that they combine this dynamic motion. There's often a lot of motion, even though the sort of language of the major arcana is often very static in the sense of being hierarchic or a deeply balanced icon. And so even if there's a gesture, it has the sense of being very still and composed and balanced. Whereas there's so much dynamics in the lower cards. And I was thinking of both film stills and comic book frames, both of which are coming to be in roughly the same kind of period of time, and so they express a very modern feeling of dynamics, even as they remain in this kind of archetypal frame where most of the images are kind of medieval or neo-medieval, at the very least informed by kind of craftsman values, but at the same time there's something very modern and open about them, as if here, take these stills of a story and rearrange them or discover a new arrangement, and out of that tell your own story.
Yes, and she was trained at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn to be a book illustrator, although the articles about her that were in the Pratt newsletter basically said in a very kind way that they couldn't really teach her anything because her style and her way of doing things was so unique. But she did learn a lot about illustrating someone else's story. So making it come alive. And that's what you see so much in this book about her. All the examples of her other artwork is that aliveness. She illustrated a book on the Russian ballet that was written by Ellen Terry because they had recently come to London and were, the biggest thing that was going on there. And the dancing, you can get the feeling of the movement. So yes, I think you've made an excellent point there, is that she really made scenes come alive and you have a sense of something going on, something happening. We're familiar with it with modern storytelling, and some of the great illustrators of the 19th century also caught that. But that's what makes it so available to the middle of the story. Whereas the major arcana, as you said, they're very static. They're kind of based on the tree of life, which has these two columns on either side and a figure in the what's called the middle pillar sitting in the middle. So many of those are this kind of static archetype, if we want to put it that way, to mix up occultism with Carl Jung.
Well, which is almost inevitable in this story.
Yes. And, but yeah, the storytelling character and there's a universality that actually comes there with that storytelling faux medieval style of design and costume, that you can sort of place it anywhere, anytime. And that's what people have done. Almost all the modern decks today have work off of her minor arcana. So they play with it. They either copy it fairly closely, or they are doing a dance that is obviously in relationship to it.
It's funny you use the word dance there, and that one of my the parts that really fascinated me about Stuart Kaplan's main essay in the book is he pulled out this sort of these images of dancing women in particular, and because one of the questions you want to ask is like, well, what's really motivating her? Like, how deep or what are her spiritual sources? And we know that she spent time in the Golden Dawn, but she wasn't like a deep member. And I'd love to hear you reflect on that a little bit. But just to stay with the dance for a bit, there's something very powerful and, dare I say, pagan that comes through these images. There's a kind of a more of a Dionysian quality than you would expect at this time and place in terms of the energy, even if it's still decorous to some degree. And it feels like with these dancing women, you're understanding something about her own self-expression, because she was clearly a very dynamic person, very colorful, interesting fashion choices, someone, a life of the party kind of person. What could you say more about the figure of the dance and how important that was to her and her approach to mythology, or her approach to images in general?
A couple of things. First, that first article, the strongly biographical one, is actually by Elizabeth Foley O'Connor.
Okay. Thank you.
But we all contributed, shared information, edited each other's pieces, and Stuart Kaplan was with us 100% of the way. But she's the one who actually did a huge amount of research and pulled together a very strong biographical piece, partly because there's a lot of stories that go around about Pamela Colman Smith. There's huge parts of her life that very little is known about. And then a very short period when there's a huge amount known, because there were hundreds and hundreds of articles written about her during a very short middle period of her life. But to get to that dance, she was involved in theater from a very young age, because her mother was renowned in Brooklyn for being part of kind of society drawing room dramas. When they moved to England, because her father was working in the arts and crafts construction, furniture business, and was bringing some of the American ideas to England, it seems that they were also very involved in the arts world and especially theater. It was with her father that she first met Henry Irving, who was the head of the Lyceum Theater that Ellen Terry was acting in, and Pamela Colman Smith traveled with them. She also made little theaters. They have the end of the 19th century, very popular to make these home little mini theaters that would just be like, 18, 20 inches high and wide. And you'd have little cardboard figures that you would move around and act out different theater pieces. And Shakespeare was very, very important to her. And anyone who's seen Shakespeare on stage, it's full of action and movement and song and dance. So she was involved with it on stage. She did costume design for the Lyceum Theater and for William Butler Yeats. And then her own sense of theater and movement and color. That was one of the big complaints about her, is that her colors were so wild and so bright, and people were going to a more limited, dull palette at that time. But hers were just, brilliant oranges and greens and reds. And then another factor that added into that was that she, from the age of 10 until around 19, 20 years old, she lived for most of the year in Jamaica, where her father was working for a railroad there. So she became enamored of the folk tales that were taught to her. And for the middle part of her life, part of the way that she made money was as a professional storyteller, where she dressed up in the bright colors of the Jamaican women and would sit on the floor, and with little figures like the ones she used in the miniature theaters, she would tell the stories in the Jamaican accent. So all of this is this kind of dynamic, lifeful music, dance, theatrical energy that was around her that she epitomized.
Yeah, that's great. I want to stay a little bit with that, the connection with Jamaica. I was thinking about this, and for our, kind of modern sensibilities that might strike us a bit off, of like dressing up like a Jamaican woman and telling stories in pidgin. But in the context, in the context of the times, it was really quite a strong gesture. One of the things I noted was that her written retellings of some of these tales appeared in early anthropological collections, and that she was actually the first one to write in pidgin, in Jamaican patois. And while that might look a little off for us today, because we have a lot more layers of how these representations have unfolded in the 20th century. At the time, it wasn't just innovative, but it was actually, deeply respectful. It was something that Zora Neale Hurston, for example, did in her stories about from Haiti and from the South, where it was actually in order to honor the particular forms of English that were being expressed in these stories, you had to imitate and rather than quote unquote correct them. So it was a very interesting part of her. But I'm curious whether you see any connection between her influence from or her love of Jamaican mythology and the Anansi stories and the vibrancy of the images and tales and characters that she was exposed to in those years. Any connection between that and the later images in the deck, which on the surface look more European, medieval Shakespeare, a little bit of Irish myth in there. But do you think that there's some influence there as well?
There's not a direct influence in terms of bringing in any of the figures from the Anansi stories or even specifically the backgrounds. What we see is far more the background around the Ellen Terry's home in Small Hythe in the southeast part of England. But there's a certain vibrancy that she carried forward from her time there, and that love of bright colors and joyfulness and the sense of story that she got from that, because she did two little booklets of those stories that she illustrated herself. They're in this big book, the storytelling or picture book that Stuart Kaplan has done. He includes so much of that imagery that you can look at. So there's a feeling that she got from that, but there's no direct taking of any of those images into these that I've seen or found.
Right. No, I could see that for sure. I want to talk now about the esoteric side of the tale and the Golden Dawn. One of the things that interests me about her story is that her work ends up being arguably the single most influential vector of the whole Golden Dawn experiment. If you're into esotericism in the occult, yes, the Golden Dawn is important in many different ways, if for no other reason than it minted, Aleister Crowley. But if you're not really in the occult, if you're in the broader culture, the only place you're really going to stumble across any resonance of the Golden Dawn is in this remarkable deck. But her own relationship with the Golden Dawn was like a lot of people who enter spiritual groups, and she had her own reasons. She was there out of some mixture of, interests, or her friends were in it, and, she was drawn to it, but she didn't, kind of dive deep. And not to say that, she wasn't an authentic magician or anything like that. It's actually the opposite. It's the way in which I think that when we try to wrestle with the importance of magical orders, and I know you wrote a whole book about the women of the Golden Dawn, and you have a lot to say on the topic. Obviously, some of the women of the Golden Dawn were powerful movers and shakers that really shaped this occult, this esoteric current that came out of the order. But I think it's also really important for us to remember that when we think about magical groups or esoteric orders or, strange underground scenes that gather around charismatic figures or charismatic practices, that people are there for a really wide range of reasons. And some people might be really deep into the lore, the mysticism or the arcane symbology, but other people are there for, in some ways, ordinary reasons. And that's part of what it's about. It's not like once you become a member of an occult order, you become this sort of like, deep mage who's completely obsessed with esoteric secrets. Some people might do that, but other people are there for other reasons, and that can be just as legitimate an expression of the current. So especially since you wrote this, very well received and important book about the women of the Golden Dawn, such an important story in modern esotericism, how you see her relationship to the Golden Dawn stuff in contrast to Moyna Mathers or Florence Farr or whatever, in terms of how it allowed her to express something of that current, but also to do it in her own way.
Yeah, she was only in the Golden Dawn for a short while, and when she joined, it had already come to a schism, a breaking apart, and so she joined Waite's far more mystical, rectified order, which he used that word, the rectified order. And so she was following Waite, who had a mystical Christianity as a background, whereas the Golden Dawn was much more aligned with an Egyptian pantheon, although they included far more than that. She said that for her, there was this delight in the rituals, but not so much in learning all the memorized systems and so on that Golden Dawn people had to memorize, the Hebrew alphabet and all kinds of correlations between everything you can possibly imagine, the names of all these angels. They would have to take tests on all of this. And she didn't seem to be someone who was very interested in that. She always went her own way. As a matter of fact, she became a Roman Catholic soon after completing the deck. And then the World War I came along. She was very involved in making things to contribute to the war effort. Like she would sell children's toys, but then all the money would be going towards the war effort. And she did posters for both suffrage and the war effort. But really her claim or the reason why Waite chose her is that she was highly psychic. And that came out later in, or during this period, was known for her pictures to music. And that's where she would sit and listen to music being played live, preferably by the composer himself. And she would draw as fast as she could these images that she would see as she listened to the music. And she said that if, while drawing these images that appeared before her, if she tried to change anything, the image would immediately close down. It was like the iris on a camera. It would open up, show her this image, and then if she started to change something, it would just snap shut. So she had to train herself to keep open to the image that came to her. And composers like Debussy, who became a friend of hers, said that she drew what he saw when he was composing the music. She also would take her drawings and take them to other musicians and ask them to play something based on the image she had drawn. And many of them would play very, very similar kinds of music. So she felt it was a two-way street.
Yeah, this was a marvelous discovery of this book. And it really, because whatever you want to say about what psychic powers are, or this or that, deep, again, archetypes or not, just the fact that she would go into a kind of altered state, or a kind of visionary state, let's say, a visionary state that was literally visionary, that was cued by music, which is so abstract in some sense, so non-representative, and yet translated almost like a synesthesic experience, although you're not mixing senses so much as, well, it is kind of mixing senses. You're taking and sound into image. Yeah, you're right.
As a matter of fact, the term synesthesia came into being right around the time that people started reporting on her. So she was reported as an example of that, of seeing music.
That's amazing. It's funny. There's so much stuff. There's something about this time because, like Scriabin, the composer at that time, he was a synesthete, and he sort of not only wrote his music with, a kind of color scheme in mind, but even experimented with color organs. And it was the first time you had people developing in the idea of a color organ, something that would play music and play color at the same time. And also, if you look at the really pivotal book, Thought Forms, which is by Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater, that was, important figures in the Theosophy movement, that some people point to as really the first abstract art images that we have, because what they were doing in that book was showing what different emotions or experiences would look like to someone with psychic vision. And there are these sort of abstract patterns of color. But in that book as well, they also talk about images, more pictorial images that are associated with music. So there's some way that the connection between music and illustration, and it's again that idea that illustration might seem trivial to some people in comparison with art, great art with a capital A, where the people are coming up with their original visions and they're making coming up with new techniques, whereas illustration is sort of a handmaiden to stories, or in this case to music. But there's something equally, if not sometimes more profound, about illustration, in contrast to sort of high art, in terms of its ability to stir these kind of visionary potentials, or these patterns of symbols, the emergence of some kind of rich world of imagery. And so the fact that she was literally experiencing that, it's not just a way of talking about her work. Her work is partly a direct expression of these visionary capacities that some people have.
Yes, and many of the newspaper articles written about her during this time really focused on how unusual she was and what innovative experiences she was bringing to the art world.
Oh, so that was actually part of her kind of rep, was the fact that she made these images.
Yeah, music as pictures.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. That sounds good. It reminds me again how, whatever, that the peculiar quality of some of her images, again sticking with the numbered cards in the Rider-Waite deck, because people are familiar with them. Rachel Pollack had a great phrase where she talked about a handful of these cards as being gate cards. Examples like the Three of Wands with the guy looking out onto the water in the distance. You don't see him, and there are these odd cards because while they're illustrating something, they're illustrating something. It's not really clear what's happening. It's you're in a story that's as much about an enigmatic unknown, or a kind of melancholy feeling, or a sort of movement of the spirit that doesn't have a particular obvious meaning. And it's in those kinds of images that I feel like there's a connection again between the art of illustration, coming out of illustrated books, or coming out of the idea that you're illustrating some story or some other event in kind of with these well-defined lines that have a slightly cartoon character in the good sense of the term, and at the same time there's something profoundly mysterious in those images. So what do you think about this idea that some of those cards are gate cards, or have a particular kind of charge to them that brings them beyond just illustrating a certain kind of emotional state or possibility?
Well, people talked about her art, not specifically the tarot art, but her other art, as opening windows or doorways to an unknown world. And that kind of became a theme among several of the commentators on her work, that it did seem to take you into some other place, but specifically you would use the word unknown, and that's what they talked about, that she opened the doorways to an unknown world. So that idea of gate cards, which I don't think Rachel was at all familiar with these newspaper articles at the time, was picking up on the same thing. And that's what makes it so exciting when you're doing a reading, is I very often will ask the client to talk about one or more cards, and I ask them to simply describe the card. And in that description, a very literal description, not to get into any metaphors or meanings or anything like that, but in that description, there starts to create a world. There starts to create a story. And then we take it a little further into, if this was a child's story that began once upon a time, and this was the illustration, what would that story be? And so they begin, once upon a time, there was this, man in a red cloak standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out at the boats that he had just sent off on a long voyage, and thinking about, and then they go on and on. And of course, from a psychological point of view, everything that they're saying is actually a projection of their own current state, and usually reflects back directly to their issue.
This is great that you made the transition yourself to talking about of how you read, or how you encourage people, your clients, to read the cards along with you. You talked about when you first discovered the tarot in the 60s. You were, very, influenced and interested in Jung and the idea of archetypes. How has, and obviously that remains a continuity in your work, but how has your sense of what's going on with the cards changed since then, in terms of either what's happening, or the best way to think about what's happening, or not think about what's happening? I'd love to hear that.
Well, tarot's been kind of at the forefront of everything I do for 50 years. So, it's hard to say how things have changed, because I started out with connecting these images on the cards with the archetypes of Carl Jung. And my latest work that I'm working on now is an archetypal, a Jungian approach to tarot. And it's in all of my books, but I'm finally coming out with a book that actually very specifically looks at Jung's theories and how they play out in the tarot. So, and on one way, it hasn't changed. In another way, I've spent 50 years studying and exploring and experiencing everything I possibly can about the tarot. And the Rider-Waite-Smith deck has been my constant companion through all of that. I own lots of other decks, and periodically I'll spend some time with another deck, but that's my core deck. So, to talk about what I've learned or how it's changed is to talk about my life.
Yes, no, I understand that. And then also in terms of how you approach readings, is there are there sort of rules, or not rules, but practices that you have now when you're working with clients that have really changed over that long period of time, or again, is it another very complex story where there's not very obvious shifts necessarily?
Oh, I've constantly added new dimensions to it, but it all comes out of the same kind of source. It's just becoming more aware of different techniques. Like through the years, I've explored lots and lots of different variations in guided visualizations and channeling. And I'm not a channeler per se, but I've certainly have studied and explored it in psychic development work and psychological forms of guided visualization, active imagination, which is the term that Carl Jung used and has its very specific steps and intent. My book, 21 Ways to Read a Tarot Card, kind of goes through the major techniques that I've developed over 50 years. And most of them relate in some way back to a Jungian approach of looking at an image, telling a story, and in that, whatever you say, seeing that as a projection of the moment, the synchronicity of the moment that you drew this card at this time for this situation. That's the synchronicity of all that coming together. And if you're getting a reading with this particular reader, all has a very strong relationship to the message or information that you are going to get at that time. The techniques I use are a combination of traditional tarot reading. I can go back to basics at any point, but also guiding a person through the experience. I call my readings a reading that is interactive, transformational, and empowering. And each of those words has great significance to me as to what my intent is and what I'm doing with someone in a reading situation.
I mean, one of the wonderful things that seems to me about the tarot in particular, but also other currents within esotericism broadly taken, or psychic work, is that it creates the opportunity for people, not necessarily people who are experts or who have completely devoted themselves to these practices, but who are just encountering it, to have a framework to do their own kind of active imagination. You mentioned Jung's idea and the practices that you discover if you're doing deep depth psychology work of working with the imagination's capacity to come up to sort of produce in a not dissimilar way from the way that Pamela Colman Smith would see stories and images emerge while she was listening to music, that there's a way to free up the unconscious, the dreaming mind while we're awake, and to work with or at least witness this kind of image production. And especially now when we're surrounded by manufactured images, by photographs, by digital images, by CGI that looks more and more real. There's screens everywhere. And a lot of these stories that people are interested in, they have fantasy elements, they have quote unquote archetypal elements in them, and that's, good and bad in some measure. But one thing that does seem to me to be happening is that the imagination, meaning one's own capacity to elaborate creatively, spontaneously images that have meaning for you, that capacity is not really supported by much of our current reality. And in fact, in any way, it almost is sort of almost an endangered species, because it's so much easier just to plug into somebody else's concocted imagination through the TV screen or the Netflix screen or any of the other worlds that we can kind of lose ourselves in. And one of the wonderful things about tarot, again, and other practices that work with imagery, is that you're invited to like kickstart your own active imagination and see where it goes, and whatever happens is going to be resonant in some way or another. And that seems like a really powerful thing to keep alive as possibilities that people can have.
Well, you've brought up, I think, some really important perspectives and ones that I hadn't sat down and thought about so much. The computer games and all the different media forms. One of the big differences is I'm realizing now between those two is the active part of active imagination. And for Carl Jung, that is especially important because a lot of guided visualizations are very passive. You're observing something just like you would watch the media on TV. But active imagination, Jung specified that you had to be present in the fantasy, in your imaginative scene. You interact with the figures that are there. You accept what's happening as real within its own framework, within its own reality. That unknown world that Pamela Colman Smith talked about is as real as our real, but it's a different sphere. So you accept that as real. You don't question what's going on until you come out. And Jung really emphasized turning your experience, or actually sometimes at the same time you're experiencing it, putting that into an art form. So whether it was a drawing or painting or even dance or sculpture or music or whatever your art pulls you to put into a concrete form yourself, that experience. And then also to actively, after the fact, go over everything with an ethical and moral evaluative judgment, and then turn that into some outer action in the world. Carry forward what you learned and got out of that experience into some relational thing that you do with other people in society and culture.
Yeah, that's great. And for you, it seems like the tarot allows both a kind of way to stir up those imaginative juices, kind of kickstart them, give them a little nudge. And at the same time, the study of the tarot over time, particularly, is also part of that moral reckoning. It's also part of the way that you shape these imaginative forces into active stories and active inspirations that are designed to go into your life, to be part of your real everyday life, and not just to exist in a kind of realm of fantasy. If it was just fantasy, if it was just in the imagination, in a way, it's kind of missing the point. There's a practical aspect to these images that is part of what gives them such power.
Yes, and he saw it both in terms of creative expression, which is so powerful that we, step from fantasy into our own creativity, and then that moral, ethical obligation to enact something in the world.
Well, talking about one's own expression, at least at a certain period of time, people started making their own tarot decks, like whether they were artists who said, I'm going to make a tarot deck, whatever. Dali made his tarot deck. Lots of artists had made their tarot deck, or individuals who didn't even necessarily consider themselves artists, maybe using collage or something to kind of develop their own story with the actual medium themselves. Is that still as robust as it was, let's say, in the 70s and 80s? And if so, or even not, how do you feel about that particular kind of thing of people saying, I'm going to do it myself, I'm going to make my own images, and what happens when people express themselves through the medium of the tarot deck?
It has mushroomed like an atomic cloud. And part of that is because there are processes now for um, printing processes that are much, much cheaper than they were before, can be done very quickly. Some people send things off to China, but we're also getting more and more of that kind of equipment here in the United States, so that someone can do a short run of 20 decks, 100 decks, 1,000 decks, at, reason possible amounts of money. It used to be that it was totally impossible to even for an individual to be able to create a deck for themselves, partly because of how do you market it. But the other part was just coming up with the money to have it printed in the quantity that you would have to make it viable. So now you can do these short run decks at a fairly reasonable price, and through the internet have people buy them. So you might only sell 500, but you get 500 out there at more than what you would pay for a deck out of the store standard catalogs. So there's been a mushrooming of these decks, everyone coming up with their own version using all different kinds of art forms, two-dimensional art forms.
But it's still the case. Would you say that some of Pamela Colman Smith's images are just, even as people are making their own versions, a century plus after the fact, that they still shape what people come to when they decide to illustrate a particular a card?
Definitely. And part of that, just to be absolutely clear, is that it makes the decks readable because people can transfer what they learned from the Pamela Colman Smith style decks, which are the majority of decks that you find in the English-speaking and Asian world. And because on continental Europe, there's still a lot of people that hold to the old Marseille style with the unillustrated pips. But the majority of the world has really adapted this format. So once you learn how to interpret those cards based on those imagery and the meanings that go with them, then you can carry it across to the majority of the decks that come out. So people are sort of locked into something that at least somewhat relates to the Pamela Colman Smith imagery. What has happened simultaneously among those people who want to range outside of that is that there's also been a mushrooming of what are most generally called oracle decks. And those are decks that can be any number of cards using any kind of symbolism and imagery that they want. And those are growing probably almost as fast.
Oh, that's a really helpful distinction. I hadn't quite made it, but it makes total sense to me. I think that my preference is probably still for the tarot, and I think it's partly because one of the things that's difficult for us now is that we kind of want tradition, but we don't want the capital T traditions that maybe mainstream religion has for us, or more conservative ways of insisting on revealed truths. And so the tarot allows this sort of interesting threshold between popular culture and personal inspiration and a tradition. At this point, it's a modern tradition. It's something that we can feel we're inside of a constraint. It's a genre. It has certain rules. It has certain expectations. And if we stay within those, it can be very powerful for many people who don't know you, don't know your inspirations, don't know your influences. So it allows individual expression within a kind of recognizable template that kind of creates the sense of tradition, of continuity that we want. Even if you go back to the origins, it's really not that long ago in terms of at least the differences that this particular deck was making. So I think it's actually a really wonderful balance of novelty and something like tradition.
Yes, and people responding to tradition, there's the feeling that the tarot deck through all the years that it's been read as a divinatory tool, which is primarily since the end of the 18th century, that it covers our life experiences. So the images can be reinterpreted in terms of modern day experiences very easily. And many of the decks take the sense of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and her imagery, but modernize it into urban environments, or they take it into other mythical spheres and realms of trying to think what the one with the goggles and all the mechanistic
like
stuff.
cyberpunk kind of steampunk.
Steampunk.
Yeah,
steampunk, that's the word. Thank you. So there's steampunk decks, there's there's decks with almost every theme, also all kinds of cultural decks, so that people from cultures around the world have been able to see their own myths in the tarot and have been able to bring those gods and goddesses and stories into the tarot, and yet still have the images recognizable by anyone who knows the tarot. So there's the confidence that you're actually covering this kind of archetypal range that is pan-human, that it speaks to humans around the world in whatever culture, and reflects that culture's myths in as well as it does our Western ones.
Yeah, and we got a minute here left, and I just wanted to mention that it also seems to have created a very open place for people to explore gender, and particularly women, to take the lead. It's really, the whole story of tarot is so rich with modern women's stories, and including your own, including Rachel's, including many people, including Pamela Colman Smith's, and it's that, for that reason alone, I think it's really one of the key elements of the kind of modern esoteric world.
Yes.
Well, Mary, I just wanted to throw that in again. We could talk more about that, but the time is the clock is relentless. So thank you so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thank you for asking me to be here. This has been fun.
Great. Mary Greer, who's contributed to the new book, Pamela Colman Smith, The Untold Story. It's a wonderful book of images. At the very least, go online and look at some of her marvelous pictures. And then until next week, keep your minds open.